It began as a whisper, an unease spreading through the streets of New York, across the heartlands of America, and into the grand halls of Europe. At first, no one knew what to call it. A shift in fortune, a temporary downturn. The stock market had seen bad days before, but this time, something was different. This time, it wasn't just numbers on a ticker board that were collapsing. It was lives, entire families, generations of wealth vanishing in an instant. Imagine waking up one morning, stepping onto a bustling street where men in crisp suits still hurried to work, newspapers tucked under their arms. But by nightfall, those same men, once the image of prosperity, were standing in breadlines, their eyes hollow with disbelief. How did it happen? How did the world's most powerful economy crumble so quickly? And most importantly, was it really just an accident of economics? Some say the Great Depression was merely the result of a market spiraling out of control. Others whisper of something deeper, a pattern woven into history, a force lurking behind the scenes, pulling the strings of the financial world. Because when you look closely, the crash of 1929 wasn't the first time fortunes disappeared overnight, and it wouldn't be the last. Stay with me. We're about to unravel a story of greed, desperation, and secrets buried beneath the ruins of a fallen economy. What if the Great Depression wasn't just an economic disaster, but something far more deliberate? Now let's step into the chaos. The first cracks in the foundation didn't appear overnight. They were there, hidden beneath the surface, long before the infamous crash of October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. Some saw the warning signs and chose to ignore them. Others, blinded by the dazzling glow of prosperity, never saw them at all. The Roaring Twenties had been a decade of excess. The stock market soared, businesses flourished, and people lived as if the good times would never end. From the bustling streets of New York to the silent farmlands of the Midwest, a dangerous belief had taken root, one that whispered, "Wealth is infinite." The economy was booming, fueled by reckless optimism, credit-driven consumerism, and an ever-growing bubble of speculation. Banks lent freely, investors poured their life savings into stocks, and ordinary people became convinced that they too could taste the American dream. But beneath this glittering surface, something dark festered. The warning signs were there, in the unchecked greed of Wall Street, in the quiet struggles of farmers drowning in debt, in the whispered fears of economists who saw the unsustainable rise in stock prices. The illusion of prosperity was built on borrowed money, and no one wanted to believe that a reckoning was coming. One man, a stockbroker named Richard Whitney, had spent years climbing the financial ladder. He had seen fortunes made overnight. He had shaken hands with the wealthiest men in America. But on October 24th, 1929, what would later be called Black Thursday, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The ticker tape that tracked stock prices was falling faster than anyone had ever seen. A sell-off had begun and it wasn't stopping. He watched as his colleagues panicked, as millionaires suddenly found themselves ruined. Yet even then, some believed the market would recover. It had to, but it didn't. On October 29th, the market collapsed completely. Panic spread like wildfire. Banks failed, businesses shut their doors, and ordinary Americans, who had once believed in an endless future of wealth, found themselves ruined. The stockbrokers of Wall Street, once the kings of finance, now leapt from their office windows, their dreams shattered in an instant. The fallout was immediate and merciless. And yet, amidst the chaos, something peculiar happened. While millions suffered, a select few seemed untouched. Some of the wealthiest families in America, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Warburgs, emerged from the ashes unscathed, even stronger than before. Some whispered that they had seen the crash coming, that they had quietly pulled their money out before disaster struck. Others believed something more sinister, that they had orchestrated the collapse themselves. Because when you follow the money, the story of the Great Depression becomes more than just an economic downturn. It becomes a puzzle, one with missing pieces, shadowy players, and a lingering question. Who truly benefited from the suffering of millions? The world was changing, and the balance of power was shifting. But if you thought the crash was the worst of it, you'd be wrong. Because what followed was far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The panic spread like wildfire. What had begun as a financial catastrophe on Wall Street quickly spiraled into something far worse, a crisis that reached every corner of America. leaving no one untouched. The morning after Black Tuesday, the newspapers ran headlines of ruin, of fortunes lost, of men who had placed everything on the line only to watch it vanish in a matter of hours. But for the millions who hadn't invested in stocks, the true nightmare was only just beginning. Banks were the first to crumble. The institutions that once symbolized trust and security were now the epicenters of chaos. People rushed to withdraw their life savings, only to be met with locked doors and empty vaults. Some had deposited their entire future into these banks, college funds, retirement savings, the last remnants of generational wealth. Now, it was all gone. In the Midwest, where farmers had already been struggling under mountains of debt, the crash was a death sentence. The land, once fertile and bountiful, had turned against them. Crops failed. Droughts choked the soil. Those who had once prided themselves on self-sufficiency now found themselves standing in endless breadlines, their pride shattered, their children starving. And as businesses shut their doors one by one, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Unemployment skyrocketed. Men who had worn fine suits and managed thriving enterprises were now selling apples on street corners for a few cents. Families that had once lived comfortably were evicted, their belongings thrown onto the pavement as they wandered in search of shelter. But here's the part that no one likes to talk about. The suffering wasn't evenly distributed. While the majority of Americans lost everything, a small, powerful elite remained untouched. Some, in fact, seemed to thrive amid the destruction. Take Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the future President John F. Kennedy. Unlike the thousands of investors who were ruined in the crash, Kennedy had pulled out of the market just in time. He had seen the warning signs, they said, or some whispered he had known something others didn't. He wasn't the only one. The bankers, the industrialists, the old money families, many of them had anticipated the collapse. Some had even bet against the market, profiting from the destruction. It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just foresight. It was a game, and they had been playing it long before the rest of the world realized they were pawns. The question was, did they merely foresee the disaster, or did they help create it? The evidence was there, buried beneath the surface. Reports of stock manipulation, of strategic sell-offs just before the crash. A financial system designed to benefit the few while leaving the masses vulnerable. And then there were the banks, the ones that didn't fail. J.P. Morgan and Company stood strong while others collapsed. The Federal Reserve, which had been created to stabilize the economy, seemed to step back at the worst possible moment, allowing the devastation to spread unchecked. Was this just the natural cycle of capitalism, a tragic accident that no one could have prevented? Or was there something more at play? A deliberate orchestration of events ensuring that wealth and power remained concentrated in the hands of a select few? As the dust settled over a broken nation, the survivors were left to ask, had they been victims of a financial disaster or something far more insidious? But the worst was still to come, because economic collapse was only the beginning. What followed was a decade of suffering, of desperation, of unimaginable choices made in the name of survival. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, they did. Hunger has a way of changing people. It strips away the polite veneer of society, reducing life to its rawest, most desperate form. As the Great Depression tightened its grip, survival became the only currency that mattered. By 1932, the United States was unrecognizable. The once thriving cities had turned into wastelands of despair. Hoovervilles, shanty towns made of cardboard, scrap metal, and anything that could be salvaged, sprang up across the country. Families who had once owned homes now huddled in makeshift shelters, bracing against the cold. Children, once bright-eyed and full of promise, wandered the streets barefoot, their ribs visible beneath threadbare clothes. But the most unsettling change wasn't the loss of wealth, it was the loss of hope. Crime surged as desperation took hold. In New York, a man was caught stealing a loaf of bread for his family. The judge, bound by the rigid laws of the time, had no choice but to sentence him. But then something unexpected happened. The people in the courtroom, strangers who had nothing themselves, began placing money on the bench, paying his fine in silent solidarity. It was a moment of human kindness, in a time when kindness was in short supply. But for every act of generosity, there were 100 stories of cruelty. Employers slashed wages, knowing workers had no choice but to accept. Landlords evicted tenants with no regard for where they would go. Banks foreclosed on homes with mechanical efficiency, tossing families onto the streets without a second thought. And then there was the government. President Herbert Hoover, a man who had once been seen as a titan of industry, now found himself paralyzed in the face of disaster. He believed in self-reliance, in the idea that Americans could lift themselves out of this crisis without direct government intervention. But as the months dragged on and starvation became a daily reality, the people stopped believing in Hoover. Protests erupted across the nation. In Washington, D.C., the bonus army, thousands of World War I veterans gathered, demanding early payment of the bonuses they had been promised for their service. They had fought for their country, and now they were fighting just to survive. But instead of receiving help, they were met with force. General Douglas MacArthur led federal troops against his own countrymen, using tear gas and bayonets to drive them out. The nation watched in horror as the government turned against the very people it was meant to protect. But the question remained, why did the government hesitate? There were those who believed that this was more than just poor decision-making. Some whispered that those in power wanted the suffering to continue. That economic collapse had provided a unique opportunity, an excuse to restructure society in a way that further cemented the power of the elite. After all, history had shown time and time again that in moments of crisis, those who controlled the system always found a way to come out on top. While the masses struggled to survive, powerful corporations bought up failing businesses at a fraction of their worth. While families lost their homes, wealthy investors snatched up land and property at record low prices. Had the Great Depression truly been an unavoidable tragedy? Or had it been exploited, perhaps even manipulated by those who stood to gain the most? As the nation sank deeper into despair, one thing became clear. The suffering was not evenly distributed, and for some, the nightmare was just beginning. Because while America bled, forces were already moving in the shadows, setting the stage for what would come next. And what came next changed the world forever. The human spirit is resilient, but even the strongest souls can break when faced with unrelenting despair. By 1933, America was teetering on the edge of something far worse than economic collapse, civil unrest, total social disintegration, and possibly even revolution. It was in this moment of chaos that a new figure emerged, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His voice, calm yet commanding, crackled through the radio waves. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It was a simple statement, but in a nation drowning in hopelessness, it became a lifeline. Roosevelt promised change. He promised action. And unlike his predecessor, he didn't believe in simply waiting for the market to correct itself. He was going to intervene. But even as the people cheered his inauguration, some weren't convinced. There were whispers among the political elite, murmurs behind closed doors. Roosevelt was dangerous, not because he was weak, but because he was strong. Because he was willing to do what others before him had refused to, challenge the powerful. His first move was swift. Within days, he declared a nationwide banking holiday, shutting down every bank in America. It was unprecedented. People panicked. Was this the final collapse? But when the banks reopened, something strange happened. Those that remained standing were stronger. Roosevelt had used the crisis to weed out the weakest links, to rebuild the financial system from the ground up. Then came the New Deal, a sweeping set of reforms aimed at putting Americans back to work, regulating Wall Street, and stabilizing the economy. For the first time, the government took direct action to help the suffering masses. Public works projects sprung up across the country, employing thousands. Social Security was introduced, offering a safety net for the elderly. The stock market was placed under stricter oversight, but for every step forward there was resistance. Powerful businessmen saw Roosevelt as a traitor to his class. They had thrived in the old system, the one that allowed unchecked speculation and corporate greed to run rampant. Now they were being forced to play by new rules, and they didn't like it. There were even rumors of a conspiracy, a secret plot among America's wealthiest men to overthrow Roosevelt and replace him with a dictator more aligned with their interests. This was no mere theory. In 1934, a decorated Marine Corps general named Smedley Butler came forward with a shocking claim. He had been approached by businessmen who wanted him to lead a coup against the president. They had the money. They had the connections. All they needed was a willing military leader, but Butler refused. Instead, he went public, exposing the plot before it could take shape. The government quickly dismissed the accusations, and no one was ever prosecuted. But the question lingered. Had America come closer to dictatorship than anyone realized? Despite these challenges, Roosevelt pressed on. But the Great Depression wasn't just an American tragedy, it was a global catastrophe. And in the shadows of its devastation, something even darker was beginning to rise. Because across the ocean, in a nation just as broken, another leader was seizing the moment. But unlike Roosevelt, his solution to economic despair would not be one of recovery. It would be one of war. While America was clawing its way out of the abyss, another nation had been drowning in its own despair. A nation whose suffering would soon reshape the world in ways no one could have imagined. Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had left the country in ruins. After World War I, the victorious Allied powers had imposed crushing reparations, stripping Germany of its resources and plunging it into an economic freefall. Hyperinflation turned the German mark into worthless paper. In the early 1920s, a loaf of bread could cost a few hundred marks. By 1923, it cost billions. People carried their wages in wheelbarrows. Children used stacks of banknotes as toys. Desperation took hold. But by the mid-1920s, things had started to stabilize, until the Great Depression shattered any hope of recovery. As America's economy collapsed, it dragged the entire world down with it. American banks, which had been lending to Germany as part of its post-war recovery, suddenly pulled their funds back. Without that support, German businesses failed overnight. Unemployment soared, starvation became widespread, and the people beaten down and hopeless began searching for someone, anyone, who could save them. And that's when he stepped forward. Adolf Hitler had been a fringe political figure, dismissed by many as an extremist, a fanatic. But the Great Depression gave him exactly what he needed: fear, anger, a nation desperate for answers. His speeches were fiery, electrifying. He promised to restore Germany's honor, to rebuild its economy, to lift its people from the pit of humiliation. He blamed their suffering on outsiders, on foreign powers, on Jews, on political enemies. And in their desperation, the people listened. By 1933, the same year Roosevelt took office in America, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. What followed was a transformation so swift, so calculated, that it left the world stunned. The Weimar Republic, Germany's struggling democracy, was dismantled almost overnight. In its place, a totalitarian regime took shape, one that would soon plunge the world into its darkest chapter. But here's the part that few people talk about. Hitler's rise was not just a product of Germany's suffering. It was fueled, in part, by the very same financial powers that had played a role in the Great Depression. There were American banks, major institutions, that had funded German industry throughout the 1920s, even as Hitler's party gained influence. Some of the wealthiest families in America had business ties in Germany, partnerships that remained intact even after Hitler took control. Ford, IBM, certain Wall Street investors. Did they know what was coming? Did they see the warning signs, the militarization, the propaganda, the calls for racial purity, and choose to look the other way? Or was there something even more sinister at play? Because history has a pattern. Every crisis, every collapse, every war, someone always profits. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic disaster. It was the event that set the stage for World War II. And as Roosevelt worked to rebuild America, Hitler was preparing for something far more terrifying. The world was no longer simply trying to recover from an economic collapse. It was hurtling toward a conflict that would leave millions dead. And the most chilling part: the pieces were already in motion. The question wasn't if war would come, it was when. The world was still gasping for breath from the financial ruin of the Great Depression, but something far more sinister was unfolding in the shadows. It wasn't just an economic collapse anymore. It was a shift in power, a quiet restructuring of global influence that most people wouldn't recognize until it was too late. Because while Roosevelt fought to rebuild America, and while Hitler turned Germany into a war machine, something else was happening, something that history books often ignore. The war hadn't started yet, but the battle lines were already being drawn. And at the center of it all, money. Take a step back and follow the money trail. America had suffered the worst of the crash, but Europe had been drowning too. Britain, France, Italy, nations that had once held immense global power, were now crippled. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's iron grip, was rapidly industrializing. In the Far East, Japan had already begun expanding its empire, seizing Manchuria in 1931, while the world was too distracted to intervene. The old world order was fracturing, and in that chaos, new alliances, secret deals, and backroom negotiations were shaping the future. Consider this. While Roosevelt was pushing through the New Deal, injecting government funds into public projects to save American families, powerful corporations were looking elsewhere. They saw opportunity not in struggling American workers, but in nations that were rearming: Germany, Japan, Italy. Major industrialists and bankers didn't just survive the Great Depression. Some of them thrived because of it. Standard Oil had connections with German industry. American auto manufacturers had factories in Nazi-controlled territory. The banking elite, the old money families, knew that war meant production, and production meant profit. But the most chilling realization? The economic devastation of the Depression had made war inevitable. Because desperate nations don't negotiate. They take, they conquer, they expand. Germany had no way to pay back its debts. Japan had no natural resources to sustain its empire. Italy, under Mussolini, dreamed of recreating Rome's glory. And America, though Roosevelt had given people hope, was still struggling to regain its footing. In 1936, Hitler marched troops into the Rhineland, defying the Treaty of Versailles. France and Britain, still weakened from the Depression, did nothing. That same year, Roosevelt won re-election, promising to keep America out of foreign conflicts. But the reality was, staying out was never an option, because the world had been set on a course that no one could stop. The financial devastation of the Great Depression had not just been a period of suffering. It had been a spark, igniting something much larger, something that would consume the world in fire and blood. And as the decade neared its end, the storm clouds of war were gathering. But the real question was, had this been the natural course of history? Or had some unseen forces ensured that things unfolded this way? The people were still recovering, but those in power were already preparing, for what was coming next would change history forever. The world was still pretending that peace was an option, but beneath the surface, the gears of war had already begun to turn. The Great Depression had not only left economies in ruins, it had rewritten the rules of global power. And as the 1930s drew to a close, one truth became undeniable. Survival belonged to the strongest, and the desperate would do anything to survive. While Roosevelt focused on keeping America afloat, other nations had taken a different path. Germany, Japan, Italy, they had embraced militarization, using the economic collapse as an excuse to expand. But here's what most people don't realize: they weren't acting alone. There were powerful figures, bankers, industrialists, even politicians, who saw the approaching storm not as a disaster, but as an opportunity. War meant production. War meant rebuilding. War meant profit. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. The world condemned the attack, but no one intervened. Why? Because the Depression had left other nations too weak to act. Britain and France were struggling to maintain their empires. The Soviet Union was too busy purging its own people. And the United States? Roosevelt was walking a tightrope, trying to keep the economy from collapsing again. But behind the scenes, something else was happening. American companies were quietly selling materials to both sides: oil, steel, machinery. The very resources that powered the Japanese war machine had origins in the United States. Some of it was indirect: trade agreements, subsidiaries, complex supply chains. But the result was the same. While Americans struggled with unemployment and poverty, corporations were making deals that would fuel a coming global conflict. And then, in 1939, the illusion of peace shattered. Germany invaded Poland. The world watched, stunned, as Hitler did exactly what he had always promised to do. Britain and France declared war. The Second World War had begun. But America remained neutral. Or at least, that was the official story. In reality, the US was already involved, just not in the way most people think. Roosevelt had been preparing for war long before the public knew it. Factories began shifting to military production. Secret intelligence operations monitored foreign movements, and most importantly, financial support flowed to Britain and its allies under the guise of aid. The Great Depression had forced America to retreat inward, but war was about to do the opposite. It was going to pull the nation back onto the world stage, not as a struggling economy, but as the most powerful force the world had ever seen. Because here's the truth no one wanted to admit. The Great Depression had made war necessary for businesses, for governments, for economies that needed a lifeline. The suffering of the 1930s had been unbearable, but war offered a way out. Jobs, innovation, a reason to unite. The most brutal irony of all, the thing that would finally end the Great Depression was not the New Deal, it was global destruction. The stage was set, the pieces were in place. And soon, America would have no choice but to step into the fight. Because war wasn't just coming, it was already here. America was still clinging to its neutrality, but the world was on fire. The Great Depression had crippled nations, and war had become the only way out. Hitler had carved through Europe with terrifying speed. France had fallen. Britain was barely holding on. The Soviet Union had been dragged into the fight. And in the Pacific, Japan was advancing relentlessly, consuming territory like a force of nature. But America was still watching from the sidelines, or at least that's what the people believed. Because behind the scenes, Roosevelt was preparing for the inevitable. War wasn't just coming, it was necessary. The American economy was still fragile, and despite the New Deal's progress, millions were still struggling. War meant production, and production meant jobs. The factories that had once shut their doors were reopening, this time producing weapons, tanks, and planes. Roosevelt had pushed through the Lend-Lease Act, supplying Britain and the Soviet Union with desperately needed materials. But this wasn't just about helping allies. This was about survival. America's industrial machine was waking up, and soon it would be unstoppable. But there was one problem. The American people didn't want war. Memories of World War I were still fresh, and isolationist sentiment was strong. Most believed that what was happening in Europe and Asia wasn't their fight. The government knew that forcing the nation into battle was politically impossible. But what if war came to them? On December 7th, 1941, that's exactly what happened. Pearl Harbor. It was the moment that changed everything. A quiet morning in Hawaii, shattered by waves of Japanese bombers. Battleships turned into fireballs. Sailors trapped below deck. Over 2,400 Americans killed in a matter of hours. It was the shock Roosevelt needed. The next day, America declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The United States had officially entered World War II. But here's where things get even more unsettling. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't entirely unexpected. American intelligence had intercepted Japanese communications, indicating that something was coming. Warnings had been sent. But somehow the attack still caught the Pacific Fleet off guard. Some historians believe it was a failure of intelligence. Others whisper about something far darker. Did Roosevelt allow the attack to happen, knowing that it would unite the American people in a way nothing else could? Was Pearl Harbor the final piece of a strategy that had been in motion for years? Because after that day, everything changed. The Great Depression was over. Overnight, the war effort became the ultimate economic engine. Millions of unemployed Americans were suddenly put to work. Factories ran 24/7, producing tanks, planes, and ammunition at a pace the world had never seen. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. The draft pulled millions of young men into military service. The United States had transformed. The same country that had been struggling to feed its people a decade earlier was now the most powerful war machine on the planet. And the economic forces that had crushed so many lives during the Depression, they had shifted. Now war was profitable. Banks, corporations, and industrial giants that had once suffered were now thriving. Steel, oil, automobiles, every sector tied to war production was booming. And as the world burned, a new superpower was rising. But the war wasn't just reshaping economies, it was reshaping power itself. Because once the dust settled, America wouldn't just be recovering from the Great Depression. It would be something else entirely, something unstoppable. The war machine had roared to life, and America was no longer the struggling nation of the 1930s. The Great Depression was now a ghost, buried beneath the relentless march of industry and military expansion. Millions who had once stood in breadlines were now in uniform or working in factories. The suffering of the past decade had been replaced with a singular purpose: total victory. But war is never just about battlefields. It's about power, influence, and most of all, money. The same corporations that had been crippled by the Great Depression were now thriving. The same banks that had collapsed in the 1930s were now financing a global war effort. The same industries that had once begged for government assistance were now producing weapons at a scale never before seen. By 1943, America's war production had reached staggering levels. Hundreds of ships were being built every month. Fighter planes rolled off assembly lines in record time. The Manhattan Project, a secret operation that would change the course of history, was well underway. The US economy had been fully transformed, fueled by a war that demanded endless resources. But there was something else, something hidden beneath the patriotic fervor and industrial might. America wasn't just preparing for victory, it was preparing for what came after. Because war ends. Wars always end. And when this one was over, the world would be divided. Someone would have to rebuild. Someone would have to lead. And America intended to make sure that this time it wouldn't just be another nation recovering from collapse. It would be the only superpower left standing. Consider this. While Europe was being reduced to rubble, American cities remained untouched. While other nations rationed every last resource, America was stockpiling. While millions were dying on battlefields across the world, the US economy was booming in a way that had never been seen before. And as the war raged on, a new global order was taking shape. The US government, the financial elite, and the corporate giants knew what was coming. This war wouldn't just be won on the battlefield. It would be won in boardrooms, in economic deals, in the reconstruction of a shattered world. Because once the fighting ended, the United States wouldn't just be a victorious nation. It would be something more. It would be the world power. But to get there, sacrifices had to be made. Decisions had to be taken, and not all of them were noble. Because war isn't just fought with bullets and bombs. It's fought with strategies, with secrets, with decisions that the public never hears about. And in the shadows, deals were already being made. Deals that would shape the next century. Deals that would ensure that once the war was over, America wouldn't just recover from the Great Depression. It would dominate the world. The question was, at what cost? The world was still at war, but in back rooms and shadowy offices, the real battle had already begun. The battle for what came next. By 1944, the United States was no longer just another player in the war. It was the arsenal of democracy, producing more weapons, planes, and ships than the rest of the world combined. The economy had reached a fever pitch, running on the fuel of war. Unemployment was a thing of the past. The Great Depression? A distant memory. But here's the truth. Most people never realized. The war wasn't just about defeating the Axis. It was about positioning America for the future. Because once the fighting stopped, the world would be up for grabs. And the people in power knew that wars don't just end with victory, they end with control. So while soldiers fought on the front lines, another battle was being fought in secret. A financial battle, a diplomatic battle, and the most powerful people in the world were making decisions that would determine not just who won the war, but who would rule the world afterward. Take the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. While bombs were still falling in Europe, 44 nations gathered in a small town in New Hampshire. On the surface, they were there to discuss post-war economic recovery. But beneath the surface, something much bigger was happening. America had a plan to ensure that once the war ended, the global economy would never collapse like it had during the Great Depression. A plan that would make sure the US dollar became the most powerful currency on Earth. And they succeeded. At Bretton Woods, the United States reshaped the global financial system. The US dollar was established as the world's reserve currency, backed by America's massive gold reserves. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank were created, both headquartered in Washington, D.C. The financial fate of the world was now tied to the American economy. And that wasn't a coincidence. It was by design. But that kind of power doesn't come without consequences, because once you control the economy, you control everything. And some began to wonder, was this the plan all along? Had the Great Depression simply been a crisis? Or had it been the opportunity needed to shift global power forever? As the war neared its end, one thing was certain. America was no longer just another nation. It was something else entirely, something unstoppable. And for the first time in history, the fate of the world was in the hands of a single superpower. But power like that always comes at a price. And the real question was, who would pay it? The war was ending, but the real fight was just beginning. By 1945, the world stood at a crossroads. The Axis powers were collapsing. Hitler was dead. Japan was on the brink of surrender. But the devastation left behind was unimaginable. Cities reduced to ashes, economies in ruin, millions displaced, starving, desperate. For the United States, this was the moment it had been waiting for. The Great Depression had been a time of weakness. But now America was stronger than ever. The war had created an economic engine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Industries had been built, technologies had advanced, and most importantly, the US was the only major power left unscathed. But here's the part most people don't realize. The war didn't just destroy cities, it destroyed empires. Britain was bankrupt, France was shattered, Germany and Japan were in ruins. The old world powers, the ones that had dominated for centuries, were gone, and that left a vacuum that America intended to fill. The Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, a massive economic aid program to help rebuild Europe. Billions of dollars flowed from the US to war-torn nations. Factories were rebuilt, infrastructure restored. On the surface, it was an act of generosity, but beneath the surface, it was something else. It was control, because aid came with strings attached. The countries that accepted it were tied to the American economic system. Trade agreements, military alliances, a quiet, unspoken rule. If you took American money, you played by American rules, and for those who refused, there was another way to secure power. The Cold War had begun, because while the Great Depression had reshaped economies, World War II had reshaped ideologies. And the new enemy wasn't another fascist dictator, it was the Soviet Union. Communism versus capitalism, East versus West. The world had been divided again, not by bombs or borders, but by something even more powerful, ideology. And America wasn't just fighting to defeat an enemy, it was fighting to shape the future. The dollar had already become the backbone of the global economy. But now, America's influence extended even further. It had military bases across the world. It had intelligence agencies operating in secret. It had corporations expanding into foreign markets. The same government that had once struggled to provide jobs in the 1930s was now financing revolutions, overthrowing governments, and installing leaders who aligned with its vision. Because the Great Depression hadn't just changed America, it had changed the way power worked. And the people who controlled that power knew one thing: economic collapse would never be allowed to happen again, not because they feared suffering, not because they cared about the people who had lost everything during the Depression, but because they had learned something far more valuable: control the economy, and you control the world. The United States had become a superpower, but that kind of dominance doesn't come without consequences. Because the same system that had lifted America to new heights, it had also created something else, something darker. A system built not just on prosperity, but on conflict. A system that required constant expansion, constant control, constant war. Because once you've built an empire, the hardest part isn't rising to power. It's making sure you never fall. And for the first time in history, one nation had the ability to shape the world however it saw fit. The question was, how far would it go to keep that power? The world had been rewritten. The Great Depression was a distant scar, and in its place, something new had emerged, an empire unlike any before it. But power is never absolute, and even as America stood at the pinnacle of global dominance, the shadows of its past and the uncertainty of its future loomed large. Because here's the truth that few recognized at the time: the Great Depression never really ended. It simply evolved. The economic collapse of the 1930s had been a warning, A lesson in what happened when financial power was left unchecked. The war had provided a temporary solution, but war couldn't last forever. The moment the last battle ended, a new question arose. How do you keep an economy alive when the world no longer needs tanks, bombs, and bullets? The answer was terrifyingly simple. You create new wars, not always in the form of battlefields, but in the form of conflicts, economic, political, ideological. The military-industrial complex, the system that had saved America from the Depression, couldn't simply be shut down. The war machine had become too profitable, too powerful, and so, in the decades that followed, the US found itself involved in conflict after conflict. The Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, the fight against communism, the battle for resources, the endless push for control. Because the moment America stopped expanding, the moment the economy slowed down, the ghosts of the Great Depression would come crawling back. This was the unspoken truth behind America's rise. It had conquered the Depression not by fixing the system, but by redirecting it, by turning crisis into opportunity, by ensuring that economic growth was always tied to something else, something bigger, something that justified the spending, justified the control, justified the power. And as the years passed, the system only grew more complex, more dependent on conflict. Look at 2008, a financial collapse not unlike 1929, banks failing, millions losing their homes, panic gripping the nation. But this time, there was no war to pull America out. Instead, something else happened. Bailouts, government intervention, a controlled collapse. The financial elite had learned their lesson from the Great Depression. Never let the system fail completely, just enough to reset it, enough to consolidate power, enough to keep the cycle going. Because that's what this was. A cycle. Crisis, recovery, growth, collapse. And then? Repeat. And every time it happened, the same people profited. The same institutions survived. The same industries thrived. So now we have to ask ourselves, was the Great Depression really an accident? Or was it the first domino in a chain reaction that never truly ended? Because when you step back and look at history, you start to see a pattern of collapse and reconstruction, a pattern of war and profit, a pattern that keeps the powerful in control while the rest struggle to survive. And if that's true, if the system is built on this endless cycle, then there's only one question left to ask. What happens when the next collapse comes? Because make no mistake, it's coming. It always does. The only question is, will we see it coming this time, or will we be too late? But as always, there are more stories to uncover. What do you think? Was the Great Depression a tragic accident, or something much more calculated? Let's discuss. Share your thoughts. And if you want more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries, stay with us. Because the past, it never stays buried for long.